Welcome one and all to this webinar on funding and financing at rail and transit. My name is Adriana Levin. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Seamless Bay Area. We are a nonprofit focusing on achieving a world-class rider-friendly, high ridership, seamlessly coordinated public transportation system for the Bay Area and increasingly in California. And one of the barriers to this is the time and cost of rolling out improvements to the system, which is why we are getting involved in the topic that you are about to learn about today. The issue at hand is that the current federal funding structure for rail and transit um, awards funding for capital projects via discretionary grant programs. That is also how funding is done in California. And these grants institute a patchwork of unreliable funding across many grant programs, and many highly rated grant applications don't get funding or get funding over many years. This causes projects to be delivered much more slowly and for costs to escalate. And this is in contrast to international models that provide steady funding for good projects that help improve the system and increase ridership. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from a set of expert panelists who will describe the issues and problems with the current model and talk about potential solutions. So the first person that we will hear from is Adriana Rizzo, who is one of the leaders of Californians for Electric Rail, a volunteer advocacy organization dedicated to removing barriers to electrification via overhead catenary of California's railways through legislative advocacy and education at the local level. And I want to turn it over to Adriana. We will take questions at the end. So as you have a question that comes up, please put it into the chat and we will get to it later. Adriana.
Hey everybody, thank you Adina for that great introduction. I'm here today to present some of the main findings from a white paper that Californians for Electric Rail published earlier a few months ago about the problems with competitive programs, as Adina talked about, mentioned. So Californians for Electric Rail, we are a statewide all-volunteer organization founded in 2023. We do a combination of legislation and policy development, and also local advocacy, with the goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled, fighting climate change, cleaning our air via mode shift to rail. So the kind of key points to take away here is that California has this discretionary funding system that is failing to deliver important rail projects around the state, and we can't expect to electrify, the statewide rail network with the funding system we have right now. Part of the problem is that our system of partial grant awards based on early design drives cost escalation and delays. This is a major reason we have a reputation for not being able to build anything. In contrast, low and medium cost countries fully fund design and use state level engineering departments to deliver projects. And they also provide funding through multi-year investment frameworks and fully fund capital project budgets. We don't do any of that right now. If we were to reorient our funding programs based on these best practices, we can bring down costs, reduce delays, and be able to get a lot more ambitious with what transit projects we are building. California Electric Rail, we're very excited about with the 2024 State Rail Plan. This calls for 1,500 miles of electrification, as well as a lot of other more simpler improvements like double tracking, station improvements, and more complex stuff like tunnels. This plan envisions a integrated network of all levels of rail, bus, and regional transit. And so it's very exciting and very ambitious, and it has a total cost of $300 billion in estimated capital investments to create this network that we see here. Unfortunately, the way we currently fund transit capital is not up to the task to actually implementing this. Not only is there just not enough money to get to that 300 billion, um, it's really not paid out in a way that is cost effective. So the main program we have is the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, or TIRCIP, which lumps together stuff from the state road plan in with state of good repair, EV charging, rolling stock, um, bus stops, local transit, planning, all types of, it's a real grab bag of things. And the only way to get state rail plan, or the main way to get state rail plan projects funded is by discretionary programs like these. There's no guaranteed funding for the state rail plan, and there's no guarantee that this laundry list of projects in there will ever get funded. This is a big driver of schedule delay and cost escalation, as we'll see in the upcoming slides. Um, so one example we'll go into is the Roseville third track. So this is just a simple capacity project letting you run more trains up to Roseville, which is a suburb of Sacramento. This is a city with 150,000 residents. And it's growing rapidly. There's a real need for alternatives to driving there, which is not really currently met by the one train a day service that they get on Capitol Corridor. And there's long-term plans in the state rail plan to eventually take this up to 4 trains an hour, where more capacity is definitely going to be needed. And this is projected to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 12 million annually. So this is, quite a lot of climate impact and, important for such a little project. But they've had to piece together tens of millions of dollars from different competitive funding sources in it to build that. Um, how has that created a problem? So after CEQA was complete in 2015, there was a delay of 4 years between there until actually starting any real design on this project. It took from 2015 to 2022 to get to 30% design because they had to apply for a discretionary grant for design. That took 2 years. Then put out a call to hire somebody to do the design. That took another 2 years. And now here we are with this project that has been going on for 13 years and is still not started construction. Um, the fact that they had early construction funding awarded also gave leverage to third parties like Union Pacific and utilities to demand costly design concessions. Um, and this has also resulted in de-scoping, where it's been broken up into 2 phases. It's now only initially going to get 2 round trips. So we have 13 years to go from 1 to 2 round trips a day, and it still hasn't even been delivered yet. This is not a good outcome. Um, Another example of this is with the Link Union Station, or Link US project. This is through running for Los Angeles Union Station, so the rail hub of the West Coast and US's second largest city. This would really be transformative for Southern California. It gives you 1 seat rides, fewer delays, and would reduce annual VMT by 180 million miles per year. That's a lot, right? But because California awards construction funding based on preliminary design, this creates a lot of risk. We also spread funding across many different conceptual grant programs. Like if you look on the right here, Link US has 7 secured funding sources, and it still has a budget gap. Um, and which creates higher costs and delays. Like a sort of concrete example of this is because of this budget gap, they went back to do NEPA certification in order to seek out federal funding, which is likely no longer coming because of the Trump administration. Because they went back and had to do NEPA, they're now being sued under NEPA by the city of Vernon, a city of 200 people, for additional design changes. So this is a really concrete way of how this patchwork funding and the lack of full funding creates a lot of risk and a lot of delays for these projects. Um, the way low and medium cost countries do this is they fully fund design, and it's done by the states. So in a variety of European countries, all of which have considerably lower costs than the United States, um, the design engineering for rail projects is done either by a state-owned firm or a state agency like their equivalent of Caltrans. Um, Another best practice from low and medium cost countries is multi-year investment frameworks. So this is where you have a period of time a period of time where investment is sort of divvied out. Usually it's 5 years, but it depends. Um, and projects are guaranteed full funding in that investment period, projects within the sort of planning framework. But how soon they get that money is based on a cost benefit ratio, um, which is awarded you know, a cost benefit ratio, which can be changed with design changes. Um, but importantly, none of these countries award construction funding prior to design completion like California does, um, which is a huge driver of cost escalation. Like one, I think perhaps the most famous example of this is for California High-Speed Rail, who were awarded early design funding, were actually forced to start construction, early construction funding, or actually forced to start construction before design was complete, which led to a lot of, as a condition of federal funding, which led to a lot of costly changeover orders. This is not done in low and medium cost countries. Um, and this isn't just restricted to, other countries, however. This is also a best practice in a lot of other states in the United States. The state of New York, Utah, Massachusetts, Illinois all use multi-year funding frameworks with political oversight over whether things are approved. So it's certainly not out of the question for California to implement this. Um, and then So an example, ugh. So an example of how this would look in California is your eligibility for funding is based on service-led planning on inclusion in a plan like the state rail plan, which uses service-led planning. Basically just planning based on what is the service level of service you can deliver through these investments. And then California can adopt the federal corridor ID process for any of its state funding, which is basic. I've got this little diagram here on the bottom, and basically what this looks like is the funder provides funding for design, and then you get to that final design, and then and and then the federal construction funding comes in. Um, Another kind of example of how this would look like in California, you kind of make this list of, these are all projects from the state rail plan. These are all kind of basic capacity projects. So the idea is that you kind of have this list, you create a benefit cost ratio based on objective service goals. And then you sort of rank projects based on this benefit cost ratio, and the highest ranked projects are sort of first in line for funding, and the lower ones can work with the state to reduce costs. Um, and then, yeah, and so I think we'll have some of our other panelists will talk more about some other, in more detail about the solution and how to implement better funding practices. But these are kind of the main points. And so where do we go from here? So, California for Electric Rail, Seamless, and other partners are looking into legislation to advance this. First we'd like to see funding for state capacity to do design and funding for design separately from construction. And then, in the future, as we look at bigger funding packages for transit more broadly, looking about implementing multi-year investment frameworks into those larger agreements. So if you want to learn more, get involved, you can read our Against Patchwork and Work Funding white paper, which goes into more detail here. You could also sign up for Californians for Electric Rail's email list if you'd like to help out advance these ideas.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Adriana. We'll take the questions at the end as a reminder. Thanks for the good questions that are already in the Q&A. wanted to hand it over next to Jackson Moore-Otto, who's a fellow at the Center for um, Public Enterprise, and where he leads CPE's transit policy efforts. And he'll say a little bit more about his background as he introduces himself on the topic of commuter rail modernization and funding and financing options. Jackson.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adina, for the introduction. As was said, my name is Jackson Moore-Otto, and I lead the transportation work with the Center for Public Enterprise. We also have major foci on housing and energy. One of my particular focus areas is rail electrification and how we can get rail electrification done faster and cheaper. And the title here might be giving the game a little bit away, but we are really excited about the potential to scale finance to overcome the patchwork that Adriana has already described, provide stable programmatic funding, and in so doing, not just get more electrification with all of its wonderful attendant benefits for service, but also deliver projects faster and per mile for much cheaper. So let's talk a little bit about electrification. I want to start with two fairly simple empirical observations and then offer a theory. The first is that in the United States, electrification is underbuilt, even considering the current state of our rail network. And I would invite you to look below at this map of the United States. The black is diesel, color is electrified lines, and then again at this map of continental Europe. Again, black is diesel, color is electrified lines of various voltages or other technical standards. Not a lot of electrification in the US, and this is despite having lines, both commuter and regional rail lines and intercity rail lines, that look like pretty good candidates for electrification and for the service improvements they bring. Now, the next observation is that US electrification costs are high and rising. They're already much higher than costs in Europe, Asia, the UK, and we'll get a bit more into what costs look like in continental Europe soon, but they've also even gone up over time. Caltrain electrification, which commenced service fall 2024, as many of you on the West Coast are probably well aware, cost quite a bit more per mile than did Amtrak's New Haven to Boston electrification project in the late 1990s, despite no obvious differing physical characteristics on those corridors. If anything, you might expect the NEC is a high-speed rail line running in very dense areas to come out a bit more expensive. Now I would pause it and I'll work over this presentation to demonstrate that this is an endogenous relationship. These fit into each other. And in particular, electrification costs a lot because we don't build a lot of it, and stable funding accomplished via a federal credit facility is the way forward to lower costs. Now let's talk about electrification globally. The first is that what we call the spark effect is real. In other words, electrification is associated with big ridership gains. Electric trains accelerate and deaccelerate faster, particularly electric multiple units, which are the global gold standard. You can run trains more frequently because of this. Trains run faster. With a given fleet, you can run more trains. And electric traction is a fundamentally more reliable technology. So electrification improves service quality. And of course, this is not just about the physical plant. This is also about investing in electrical multiple units and the rolling stock that lets you run this high quality frequent service. And to make this a bit more concrete, we just saw that Caltrain in calendar year 2025 saw a 57% jump in ridership. And this jump, there's a bit of return to office phenomenon, but if you look at the time series, really it takes off as electrification enters service, and as word spread of service quality, more and more people are using the service. If you build it, they will come. But also, electrification is associated, especially on frequent lines like Caltrain and like our other non-electrified commuter or regional rail networks. For example, in Boston, where I live, with operating cost reductions on the most frequent line. Part of this is that you're moving from diesel to electricity, which in general should be cheaper. Part of this is that electric traction is fundamentally a more efficient technology. Those of you who own EVs might appreciate that fact, but also that maintenance is much cheaper. We see generally that maintenance costs fall 30% or more, looking at the UK case. When you switch from diesel to electric technology, it's a simpler technology, even accounting for lower failures. It just requires less preventative maintenance. So electrification sounds pretty great. But for all of its value, it's a bit of a funding orphan. There are a lot of federal discretionary grant programs in this patchwork that Adriana excellently laid out that could support electrification, and in some rare cases do support electrification, but there's no dedicated funding stream, whether it be a discretionary grant program, a formula funding stream, or even a credit or loan program that is specifically tailored to the needs of electrification. If you're an intercity rail line, you could tap into general purpose grants like CRISI. If you're Caltrain or another commuter rail line, you can tap into grants either on the FRA railroad side or on the transit side. And indeed, Caltrain did receive over 600 million in a capital investment grant from the federal government. This is nice if you can get it, but even then, there's real administrative burden and legwork and political jockeying associated with the path to this funding. It is not stable, it is not steady, it is not predictable. And Caltrain's case really illustrates this. Even after they initially thought they had the money, the first Trump administration delayed it, even threatened rescissions, and this resulted in further project delays and mechanistically higher costs. And when we look at the electrification more literature more broadly, particularly that in the UK and continental Europe, we see that instability is expensive. The more positive flip side here is learning curves are real. The more you build, the better you get at building, and the cheaper you can build. And just to bring in some empirics, on our left-hand side, we have major projects in the UK and continental Europe, cost per kilometer. The UK tends to be among the most expensive. Looking at our other graph, we see how much the UK in red and Germany in yellow electrify in terms of track kilometers per year. We see that the UK, unlike the US, does sometimes build a lot, right? Some years it's great. Other years, sometimes almost for a decade, they build almost nothing. Germany, on the other hand, is basically a line. I see some squiggles in the late 1990s, but it looks awfully steady. And this kind of steady programmatic funding that Germany does, and Denmark also does, Switzerland does a bit of too, and Ian will get more into the multi-year funding paradigms we see here, lets you build the muscle memory and get on that learning curve and get costs down. In other words, electrification isn't trivial. If you just do a boom bust, which is what the UK's rail industry body calls this crazy bar graph you see, you're going to forget how to do it. But at the same time, if you do it consistently, you're going to get better and better at it. And electrification is a particularly replicable kind of investment. Think about tunneling, which is less replicable. You can definitely get better at it, but you have all kinds of different soil conditions, different utility conditions, different urban conditions that make learning hard. On the other hand, for electrification, when you build out the white-collar workforce to do the work in-house, you build out the skilled trades, and you build out the upstream supply chain for things like rolling stock, transformers, overhead catenary. 1 mile of electrification is 1 mile of electrification. These skills generalize, and that brings down costs. So if filling the gap is so appealing, how do we propose doing this? At a high level, we think that scaling, financing, or credit programs make sense, particularly in the case of electrification. The ridership boost that we've seen Caltrain demonstrate and the potential cost savings I've covered means that electrification is very bankable. It's a very good fit for a loan. Both the cost savings and the ridership increment, which brings with it increased fare revenue, means that there is a stream of revenue, money that you are getting or money that you're not spending, against which you can pay back a loan. And to make this a bit more concrete, the final business case for GO Expansion, Greater Toronto's regional rail program that has electrification as sort of the cornerstone capital investment, that predicts that their fare box recovery ratio will go from low 80s in the diesel, more traditional commuter rail world to about 110%. So in other words, they're moving from a deficit to a surplus, and this is still being built out, so some of those projections have to be validated. But this strongly suggests that, again, electrification is just a really good fit for finance, particularly with the first few projects. If costs come in high or on other lines that might not perform as well, other kinds of subsidy may be needed, and that's completely appropriate. This doesn't preclude other kinds of funding sources. But what it does do is provide a pot of money that can be used to build out a project pipeline and start building steadily, as they do in continental Europe, and realize those benefits of electrification and get costs down. So how should we operationalize this? Thankfully, we have an existing framework in the US that we can work in. In particular, we at CPE are enthusiastic about the potential to streamline and strengthen the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing, or RIF, loan program that is administered by US DOT's Build America Bureau. Right now, this program offers loans at just about Treasury rates, but there are some real administrative hurdles to agencies using it, in particular, third-party underwriting requirements and large upfront compliance costs that agencies must face. To overcome this and make this a source of programmatic funding for electrification in particular, we recommend both building in-house capacity on the underwriting side to lessen those frictions for agencies and adding engineering talent, what I believe Eric Goldwyn of NYU would call a SWAT team, to assist applicants moving through the RIF pipeline with the technical details of electrification and get that technical know-how that we know lowers costs built up early. At the same time, access to this cheap credit should carry some conditions with it. Standardization saves money. In the case of Caltrain, NYU researchers have also documented how overly conservative engineering standards, such as spacing poles too closely together and having more substations than may be strictly necessary for now, drove up project costs. So having some of that standardization both allows physical trains to interoperate as we build out our infrastructure, but saves costs. More broadly, we view this as part of moving federal credit programs from ad hoc gap fillers that just function to be repaid and fill that gap when the other grant programs don't come through, to focus sources for investment for bankable projects. And if any of this is interesting to you, I will have much more on this coming out with the IFP's Transit Policy Playbook in February or March. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much for describing these potential solutions for getting electrification rolled out more reliably and swiftly. And Jackson alluded to international practices. And the next speaker is going to focus on that. So Ian Griffiths was my co-founder and co-executive director at Seamless Bay Area. He remains on the Seamless board and is currently principal consultant with CPCS, which is a transportation planning strategy and management consulting firm, and look forward to hearing more about the international good practices that we can learn from in the US. Over to you, Ian.
Yes, thanks, Adina, and thanks everyone for being here. So again, I work for a firm called CPCS, which is a management consulting firm that focuses on infrastructure, primarily transport and public transportation, really helping a lot of public clients make better decision makings. And we work across the project lifecycle, and we work on a lot of capital project policies and frameworks to enable public agencies, in particular with major projects, deliver more cost-effective and faster projects that make a greater impact. And I'm going to be focusing primarily actually just on a specific case study of some of the best practices that are related to multi-year funding, and focus on Sweden because I happen to have had the opportunity to recently spent 2 weeks there and investigate this topic deeply with some of the leaders in Sweden. I think it's a very helpful example for California and for North America. And I think listening to Adriana and Jackson, it really demonstrates how multi-year funding is tied in with two other key issues: the issue of having centralized capacity and common standards, as well as having, I would say, a sort of more outcomes-driven decision-making framework. The use of things like a cost-benefit, a clear cost-benefit analysis, and other practices that can enable more objective decision-making when we have to prioritize, when we have a funding program of many, many billions worth of projects, more than we have to actually spend. So I'll be speaking about all of those three topics in the specific example of Sweden. And then I'll finish by talking about actually just the opportunity here in California that we have to advance some of these policies that has been presented by the state Transit Transformation Task Force, having recently completed and developed a set of related recommendations on improving capital project funding. So centralized capacity is important. I think Adriana in particular highlighted why this is important. You know, transit capital projects are often highly complex and require specialized expertise. And a lot of small transit agencies just simply don't have the capacity they don't have full-time staff with experience. So they have to spend time hiring outside consultants, and that takes time to bring on that expertise. And it also adds risk if there isn't the expertise in-house to be able to oversee, those specialized, people. So Sweden has just it's a country that's smaller than, only population of, I believe, 12 million. So even smaller market than California, but they have centralized project delivery for major projects, including all rail projects, within just two agencies within the entire country. One is Trafikverket, so that is the Sweden's equivalent of Caltrans, which not only, like Caltrans, oversees all highways in the country and design and construction of anything on the state highway network, but it also does the same for the countrywide rail network, rail infrastructure. It also, unlike California, actually owns the rail infrastructure and maintains it. But importantly, any region that wants to see improvements on rail service, including of commuter rail and regional rail, needs to work through Trafikverket, and Trafikverket would take the lead in terms of doing the in-house design. They maintain standards for tracks, tunnels, all of the electrification infrastructure, all of the infrastructure required. So these are not design issues that get reinvented every time a new fairly standard rail project needs to be advanced in some part of the country. The other agency within Sweden that often advances project delivery is in Stockholm. Stockholm has its own fairly separate metro network, so that they're large enough that they can have their own project delivery group. And so if it's a project that's within Stockholm, it is advanced by a group called Trafikförvaltningen, which is a unit within the city of Stockholm. Okay, so then the second area is really building off of what Adriana introduced in her paper on multi-year investment frameworks, and I want to just describe Sweden's particular system. So they have their national plan is called the National Infrastructure Plan. It covers a 12-year investment period, and it's updated every 4 years. The most recent, this pie chart is an excerpt from the most recent plan, which covers the years between 2026 and 2037. The exchange rate between Swedish kroners is roughly 10 to 1. So just take like insert a decimal point, before the final digit, you'll have approximately the figures in US dollars. It allocates about, $120 billion US dollars towards transportation, and that's roughly half split between expansion and maintenance for the current plan. And the way that the process works is that the Trafikverket, initiates a process every 4 years where they invite regions to submit their priority investments. So regions play a major role in proposing projects that they would like to see happen. All projects, there's a common cost benefit scoring of all projects that is actually directly done by Trafikverket. So not only is there a common methodology for determining costs and benefits, but it's actually done directly by Trafikverket itself, so that all projects submitted across the country can be evaluated kind of on an apples to apples basis. And compared against how they advanced national goals. And then ultimately that results in Trafikverket, making recommendations of which projects to fund in the upcoming 12-year plan. That then leads to a cycle of negotiations whereby, there's this sort of Trafikverket recommendation of what should be included in the plan, but ultimately elected officials and politicians are involved in making those final decisions. And sometimes the recommendation is, there are projects that are lower scoring that do get included in the plan and other ones that are higher scoring that don't get included. Politics certainly, as with everywhere, politics plays a role, and there needs to be a balancing of multiple objectives. So ultimately, though, that the final plan does get approved by Parliament. So there's this national there's this very public buy-in to what is the set of projects that are going to be delivered within that 12-year period. And those projects are largely funded in full, with usually a package of funding that includes uh, national funding as well as the regions contributing. So this is an excerpt from an example project of a light rail project in Stockholm. This is this purple line on this image that resulted from the 2014 to 2017 negotiations that included an agreed upon, project funding mix of roughly half of the funding coming from the state, and then, different cities and counties contributing smaller amounts. And then part of that package was also a commitment to deliver a certain number of housing and units and other, infrastructure besides just the transportation as part of that agreement, providing that funding certainty and that multi-year funding certainty for the project to be able to proceed much more rapidly. Now, however, that doesn't mean, even though that this process does provide that funding, certainty, it doesn't guarantee that every project, if costs escalate a lot over time, is going to continue to get funded. And so they also employ something, they employ a stage gate framework to essentially, as a project moves through design, assess whether the costs and the benefits are still, a good value for money. So, a project that makes it into initially for the first time, the 12-year plan will, go through early design, feasibility study, and have to be brought back once more information is known to have its next chunk of funding allocated, and ultimately the construction funding allocated. And if costs and benefits change significantly, projects can be removed. And this diagram on the right is showing that from the most recent plan, 12-year plan, this is on the left are the costs and the benefits of all the projects, the lower performing projects that were actually removed or proposed to be removed from the plan because they, as the projects moved through design, the benefits actually were not as significant as initially thought. And then there were new projects that were proposed that had much higher benefits relative to costs, and those were ultimately proposed to be swapped out and switched out. So this is something that I think in California we see a lot of projects that have been included in prior plans that maybe aren't still a good use of funding, and we don't have mechanisms to be able to really remove some projects that don't offer good benefits from funding plans. Okay, two other practices that Sweden and then a number of other, I think exemplars use to promote greater, more evidence-based decision making is the use of business cases and the concept of having a project sponsors to own the business case. So what is a business case? Really, it's a comprehensive collection of evidence and analysis that sets out the rationale of why we should be making an investment and what problem we're trying to solve. It sounds very basic, but it's actually not a requirement of across most of North America of when a project gets started, and it is a requirement in the Swedish system. It's a document that exists throughout the project lifecycle, and it gets updated as more and more information is known. So it would include things like the cost benefit analysis, but also articulate other strategic goals and policy goals that a project is actually trying to address. And then the idea of a project sponsor is actually a role, not a document, but actually a role, often a person or an office that is responsible for owning the business case and really tracking those benefits over time and bringing it to key decision makers at those different junctures to validate whether a project is worth continuing to move forward and whether it's recommended to, continue to fund. So these are this is an org chart from the Stockholm agency that delivers projects, and they have very clearly, what I've outlined here are the people that are the project sponsors for the different modes of projects that are being pursued by that agency. And it's important to note that this role of a project sponsor is different from a project manager. A project manager's role is really to kind of oversee all the different pieces of design and technical, all of the different components for advancing a project, whereas a project sponsor is intended to be more of a high level role that is assessing whether a project broadly is still delivering the benefits that are intended and are aligned with the strategic objectives of the organization, which is quite a distinct role relative to a project manager. Okay, this is my last slide here. I just wanted to highlight that, really, again, while this panel is called funding, it has the topic of funding, that multi-year funding frameworks are very tied to, other aspects of effective project delivery and including the centralized capacity and having more outcomes-based decision making. And an opportunity we have here in California is that we just completed something called the Transit Transformation Task Force, which has completed a final report of recommendations across a number of areas to transform transit in California. Improving capital project delivery was one of the topics, and there's a set of recommendations that relate to actually doing more service-based planning or creating more robust service-based planning guidelines like is used in the state rail plan, but to be used more broadly across the state, as well as recommendations to create guidelines on business cases and more greater standards around how cost-benefit analysis should be done in a consistent way across the state, as well as building out some form of centralized capacity to develop projects that could be very useful, in particular to smaller agencies that really need that capacity. Not necessarily for larger agencies that already are large enough that they're delivering such a large portfolio of capital projects. They're able to have that full-time capacity, but really helping out some of those smaller organizations. So I think this is just an opportunity for us to, as legislators consider advancing these initiatives, or as Caltrans and other state actors seek to carry out the recommendations from the task force, to really keep in mind the opportunity to link these improved practices with the opportunity of multi-year funding frameworks, which would work very well in concert with having more centralized capacity, as well as more robust frameworks for more evidence-based decision making. And that is it.
All right. Thank you very much, Ian and Jackson and Adriana. There's some really good questions here in the Q&A. If you have more, please add them, and we will take them over the next 11 minutes or so. We'll start with the question that Adrian raised, which is that a big obstacle to passenger rail and electrification is due to regional intercity lines owned by freight companies. And I think this is also something that we might get into another upcoming webinar we're doing next week. Any thoughts on that question that Adrian has asked?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I think the first part relates directly to what we've talked about today, and then there's some other parts that are other areas not related to funding. But first of all, I think early construction funding can contribute to this issue, because when the project is already funded, it gives third parties like freight railroads leverage to demand lots of concessions, to demand that the transit authority pay for lots of improvements for them that doesn't necessarily help the transit project. And I think having late construction funding after they've already worked together with the freights on design it enables the transit agencies to play hardball a little bit more and gives them a little more leverage in these negotiations. I think additionally, Jackson didn't touch on this too much, but I believe he's also working on some stuff around financing for freight railroad stuff. And so having, a more of a mechanism for freight railroads to finance improvements themselves would also enable agencies to say, hey, use this program, just do this part yourself. Don't make us do this for you. Um, I think so I think those are things that would help. I think outside the scope of this webinar is governance reform, the very weak GPA, Joint Power Authority structure that a lot of our transit agencies runs gives them a lot of disadvantage in these negotiations. Like by contrast, California High-Speed Rail Authority, which is like a statewide agency with a lot more political clout, was like successfully able to get BNSF to agree to overhead wires over their tracks. And so I think, whereas a lot of our smaller agencies are really have board members that are disengaged or, have other priorities and just not a lot of political clout in general. And so I think moving away from the JPA structure to more like state-managed regional rail authorities would give the public sector a lot more leverage in these negotiations. And then the third thing, which I think is much easier to do once you've already implemented the fix as I just talked about, is in some cases right-of-way acquisition and actually just buying out the right-of-way from freights, particularly for less used corridors.
All right. Thanks very much. Any other thoughts about that before we take some of the other questions in the chat?
Yeah, just to jump in, I mean, I think when we talk about building out a project pipeline across the country of electrification and bringing in a more supportive federal role there, there's a bit of a parallel to me to the corridor ID process, which is focused on developing intercity rail corridors. And it's my understanding that their FRA has at least one, if not a few, dedicated staff positions for freight rail liaisons. And I think if you saw using RIF and cheap capital to build out that project pipeline for electrification, there's actually strength in numbers there, not just in terms of the level of government, but in terms of having a lot of projects and dedicated staff to either play hardball if necessary with the freights or just come to workable technical solutions if there are real issues there.
Thanks. And Anthony asks, Anthony had a really good question about the how low-cost countries decide what projects to put in their investment frameworks. And I think Ian really spoke to that in some robustness. So we'll turn to another good question from Anthony, which is that one of the unfortunate sources of early commitment to projects that we have in California is ballot measures to issue bonds or raise taxes to fund very specific named projects that might be at an extremely early stage of conceptualization and design. And so the question is this system of raising money compatible with an investment framework, stage gate-based system that contains costs and replaces or removes projects when that makes sense? Ian may have some thoughts on that about the best practices in some other parts of the world that do use ballot measures and do some robust and business case analysis and service-oriented planning. So Ian or anybody else.
Yeah, I had initially planned to talk also about Switzerland as an example, but in the interest of time, I had to just go down to one case study. So Sweden does not have a tradition of using ballot measures, but Switzerland does. In fact, I believe much of the the ballot measure system in California is largely kind of if you go back in time based off of Switzerland's system. But the timing of that when those funds are raised is very different, and the role that it plays within the project life cycle. So in Switzerland, design funding and project development funding is not raised generally from ballot measures, uh, and the ballot measures basically come into play once design has been advanced significantly, and a ballot measure is put on the ballot to actually confirm whether to actually build the project, right? So whereas very often, we had a ballot, high-speed rail is a good example. We had a ballot measure that was, very early on in the design process for high-speed rail that was, you know, um, you know, positioned as though it was going to fund the entire thing. And in fact, we were far too early in the process to have the confidence that that was going to fully fund the project. So I don't think having a ballot measure system is incompatible with, doing things in an orderly manner. And in fact, it can be good in Switzerland shows that actually um, it can be it can be a way of making sure that a project that maybe took a long time to develop is still like a priority for the public. Um, but I think just when we choose to put something on the ballot and what we're seeking to fund and what the commitments are that we put on the ballot is something that we could do a better job of in California. And if the state were to play a greater role in terms of funding the initial design of projects and not like forcing local agencies into, putting ballot measures on the ballot in order to get a project moving along, I think that could maybe reduce the pressure, the likelihood that we're going to be in that situation in the future.
All right. Thank you very much. Want to Alvaro and Jeffrey have some fairly similar or identical questions about opinions on public banking as a way to finance green infrastructure. And Jeffrey, he asks in California, and Jeffrey asks, there's a movement for a national infrastructure bank to pay for these kinds of projects, similar to how the interstate highway system got built and the WPA did their work. So any thoughts on public banking as potential for California or for the states?
I'm happy to take that one on, and Ian or Adriana, you're welcome to jump in. I am not a public banking expert. I think there's a spiritual similarity between that discussion and what we're talking about with trying to find investments like electrification that are a good fit for credit programs. But I think what we're talking about concretely right now is really taking a program like RIF that is, in fact, still somewhat underutilized and finding ways to build a capacity to make it a usable program and match it to investment classes that are a good fit for credit. Whereas to me, public banking is really in a world where you're so constrained on those loan programs that you need new sources of loans to fund out. That's maybe a potential solution there. So I think we're still a little ways off from public banking. As an immediate solution, but I think it's directionally correct. And that's a discussion I would love to have more offline with public banking experts. I will also just give a plug for a CPE publication coming out this summer, which will be a deep dive into Montreal's REM, Automated Light Metro, and the role that CDBQ Infra played as infrastructure investor and project sponsor and project initiator, and CDBQ is fundamentally a pension fund depository. So that does get a little bit closer to the public banking conversation, and I imagine we'll have more on that report potentially about public banking. So stay tuned.
All right. That is exciting about the more reports that are coming out. I'm going to take one more question from the chat to the panel, and then we'll close it out. One of the questions has to do with the political dynamics of this topic. And I guess the way that I will put this to the panel is, what do you see as the opportunities for change either at the state or the federal level? And what do you see as the sources of support, including potentially surprising support? And what do you see as the sources of opposition and ways of overcoming that, the political landscape?
I could start off, I guess. I think first of all, I think we're in this moment right now where we have high inflation in general. Federal support is not coming. The Trump administration is sort of taking an axe to the whole federal transit funding apparatus particularly in blue states. And so I think this is kind of an opportune time to reconsider why. And I think a lot of agencies are being forced to make very hard decisions about scaling back and cutting projects because of the really bad funding environment we're in. So I think this is kind of this is a good time to start having these conversations and pushing for legislation. As I mentioned, I can't say too many details right now, but Californians for Electric Rail are exploring legislation to help with the sort of design funding and state capacity side of things right now. I think, thinking at the federal level, there is the Surface Transportation Board reauthorization, which is coming up supposedly this year, but I think likely later than that, which is the major funding bill for at the federal level for transit. And so, depending on how the midterms go, that could be an opportunity to implement some of these reforms at the federal level. In terms of supporters and oppositions, I think anybody who's pro-transit in some way, whether you're a transit rider groups like a lot of us here, I think, labor unions representing, the people who build the transit or potentially it would be potential supporters, they would like a steady jobs for their workers and, just sort of less money spent on paperwork versus money spent on construction workforce, I think is shifting that balance is benefit them as well. In terms of opponents, I think a lot of transit agencies are sort of, happy, just don't want to change their ways, don't really want to have to go through what they see as new requirements or new procedures. I think particularly some of the larger and more politically well-funded agencies who are able to sort of make it out okay in the current environment. I think, maybe I'll leave it to any other panelists who want to chime in.
Right. Any additional thoughts, and in particular at the federal level, since Jackson, you mentioned federal programs?
I would second surface reauth as being really the immediate issue. I would agree that it's probably going to slip. Definitely a question of whether it slips till after the midterms. If so, I think that probably increases the scope to drive positive change. Otherwise, agree with everything Adriana said.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to our speakers for sharing their expertise. Thanks for the reports that have been already published and those that are coming out. We will share the links in email to you afterwards. Also, stay tuned for a webinar coming up next week on ElectroLink, the opportunity for electrification and level boarding across California. And we talked a bit about service-led planning as a strategy to help generate cost-effective projects. And that is something that CMOS will be hosting, and we will share more information about that event. And I think that is something that addresses Elaine's question. And finally, somebody had a question in the chat about, will the Bay Area's Connect Bay Agency ballot measure be enough for the service that we need? In California, the answer is no. That was one of the things that was recommended by the state task force members. And that is something that will be the focus of ongoing advocacy in the state of California, including with the governor's race. So stay tuned for opportunities to weigh in, because more will be needed there. Thanks to everyone again for attending. Thanks to the panelists, and looking forward to more discussions about how to achieve a faster and more cost-effective build out of our rail and transit system in California and around the country. Thank you.